Well, why don't we go ahead and start? And if Mike pops in, that's good. But in the interest of time, I think we can probably just get going. So I don't know, Bill, I don't know if you want to kick it off, or Rick and I can let you know what we've been up to. I know the last time we left off probably in, I think, August, you sent out a memo kind of with the follow-up items on the survey, and then, your thoughts on reaching out to towns directly to get more information. So I think that's where we left off, and then Rick and I picked up from there.
Yeah, that's great.
So we have, and then I thought what we could do today was just kind of share what we've learned so far. And then, I didn't kind of put the information in any kind of formal document, just because I wasn't sure what our next step was. So I thought maybe this group would just sort of let us know what we think the next steps are and what we need to do to kind of, finalize the project in general. But so we have spoken with West Hartford, Mansfield, Enfield, who we didn't originally send the survey to, but have been doing shared services for a long time. And someone we spoke with recommended speaking with them, and that was helpful. And then Suffield. So I think we were going to do 5 follow-up calls. We've done 4, one of which, of course, wasn't originally surveyed, but and then we have calls into the rest of them. I think it was Plainville and Wethersfield. I haven't heard back from. So Rick, I don't know if you want me to just sort of report kind of my takeaways, and then if you want to kind of fill in.
Sure.
Whatever. So I think, I don't know, for me, I think the biggest takeaway was really asking about, what the challenges are to these arrangements and what the recommendations that they would have for us. And one of the biggest things that I learned was that it really comes down to the leadership wanting to work collaboratively, and really how important the relationship between the town manager and the superintendent, or if it's a first select person, form of government, that individual and the superintendent or whoever's in charge on the school side, and really being on the same page, wanting to make this work. A lot of the time the IT person is reporting essentially to 2 people. So from their perspective, it sounded like it was really critical to have that strong kind of collaborative relationship and really eagerness to make it work. So obviously that's less of a tangible thing and more of a kind of qualitative aspect of an arrangement like this. And then in terms of the structure itself, it really seems to vary. I mean, Enfield has a specific IT fund, and it's outside of, like in their budget, they have an IT fund, and everything from both sides falls into that fund. Whereas West Hartford, for example, it's completely separate. So you've got the town IT and the Board of Ed IT, and then one person overseeing essentially 2 different departments. And then Mansfield, I would say, was kind of a hybrid. They also had sort of a separate IT fund, but then some of their personnel and IT related items are funded in the town budget or the Board of Ed budget. So it seems to be a mix. So I thought that was interesting in terms of, if we were to think through how the arrangement would work. I don't know, Rick, is there anything you think is worthwhile that we learned that is important to us?
Yeah, there's really, like you really said, Melissa, is that there's not really one good answer overall, great answer, best answer. I think the towns that we interviewed and got feedback from, they're all have different flavors of it. Most of them are all working to their benefit. And the bottom line is really there are shared services within those government agencies. And I look at it, I reflect when we were talking to them, I reflect back on what we've been doing here in Simsbury, and we've pretty much been doing that for a while now. I think it was either Enfield or Suffield that said something to the effect where they've never had it before. It was completely separated, and they combined. So really, I think a lot of towns in Connecticut really have some form of shared services. It's really what aspects of it are out there. But for Simsbury, I think with the Board of Education and government, and even with law enforcement, I mean, we've shared those services pretty much in the same like these other towns have. A key component that's out there is they really leave the whole law enforcement piece alone. Even though it's inside the organization, it is kind of like left separated just because of their, security guidelines, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But Suffield was a town that was very similar to us for sure, with a small staff and what they did.
Suffield, yeah, and they were the ones that were completely separate until I think she said 2 years ago.
Right.
So that was interesting, and now they're basically one department. I mean, the way they fund it between the town and Board of Ed is, a little nuanced, but it's essentially one department.
Right. And then the other commonality in the whole thing was on the educational side, whether it was a shared director, network administrator, or whatever, they did have that separation like we do, where they have a curriculum director that's out there that always existed. So it's not so much within IT, it's outside because it's more on the educational curriculum side of the district, which was unique as well.
That's a good point. Yeah, lots of good feedback. I just don't know how it would be best for us to kind of document it. If it would be, I guess it comes down to how do we want to, what is our next step, really?
I guess I have two questions to start with. I think one has to just do with timing. I know we started down this path, I'm going to say a year and a half ago, might have been longer, and with an interest on the part of the board. And do they still have that same level of interest? Do we know?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes. There's definitely still, I think, an appetite into looking into shared services. We've actually been trying it out on the finance side of things. So whereas I think we initially thought this would be the area IT where we'd look to do it first, we actually had an opportunity to sort of try it out on the finance side. So that's happening in real time, which is good because it's something we can learn from. And secondly, I think where we are right now is actually good timing because it's to the extent that there is recommendations or anything that comes out of this process, we're entering the budget cycle. So even if it's not something that winds up happening, at least it's a conversation that we can have in that context. So we, believe it or not, will kick off budget in about a month. So I think it'll be important kind of information to include while we move through that process too.
Okay. And
do we want to make recommendations, or do we simply want to, not the right term, but showcase some of the things that are happening and let the board kind of choose which direction to go into?
Yeah, I think that's a good question for this meeting today is, I think what more on towards the latter point, I think would make sense, because if we look at what we've learned and then, based on your knowledge and working with us locally with our current arrangement, I mean, what sorts of things do you think would make sense from these other arrangements for us? What might not make sense? I kind of like that idea of having not options, but more of, not one recommendation, but more, here are some things to consider, and here's what may or may not work for us. But again, I'm open to what you all think too.
I was just wondering if you heard anything where you said, oh, wow, If we could do that, that would be fantastic. Or if we tried that, that would be awful. You know, that's really where I thought the interaction with the towns would be. You know, because they could explain what they've done. They could certainly tell you whether or not they were feeling good about it. But then to try to think about it in light of Simsbury and how that might work to make it better, or would it just be a hassle?
There's another piece, though. Maybe we should wait and get it. I don't think we got them yet, but we did ask the last 3-4 towns that we interviewed for their agreement statements, their MOUs. I haven't seen one yet, but that would be kind of interesting because a couple of them pretty much described it as just in a document that was agreed upon. It was really nothing really specific. So that might lead us to an approach on how we want to handle it going forward as well. But that's something that I've not seen. I don't know if the folks on the call have seen it either, what those understandings are.
We have, I can certainly send them out. We have wait, hold on. We definitely have Enfields. We have one or two. We don't have them from all of them. But that's a good point. That way we can see in writing kind of what the format looks like. And Suffield was going to send hers too, so I'll circle back with her and remind her on that. But to answer your other question, Bill, I don't know, for me, the feedback was mostly positive in the sense that, yes, it's working. Yes, we see benefits. The one thing that wasn't, the one kind of piece of feedback that was, I thought, big in the sense that it was more of a negative piece of feedback was, a sense of, if shared service is really, you have to define what you mean by that. And in one of the cases that we learned about, it really sounded like it was 2 different departments with 1 director. So essentially you're just duplicating. You have 1 person managing 2 departments, basically. So you've got 2 separate workforces, 2 separate systems. So the only thing that was shared was really, the person at the top of the department, but essentially they're overseeing 2 departments. So I thought that was very powerful to learn, that it really has to be true sharing, at least in some way, shape, or form. So that, I thought that was a good takeaway from one of the calls we had.
I see.
Yeah.
Was that West Hartford? Yeah, it sounded like it could fit into that category.
And Enfield was like that as well, I believe. They had that 1 person.
They
Whereas
did.
Suffield probably was more the true sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there, I don't know, there was, I don't have my notes in front of me.
Just kind of have a king. Is that person, so he basically is the guy who's got to sit there and make sure that things are being shared and not replicated, across the organization. So are they really seeing savings? Is this guy able to say, gee, the Board of Ed is, moving to this type of server, and maybe, the town side has advantages. Is that IT executive actually, bringing the synergy into the thing across the 2 departments?
Yeah, it sounds like the efficiencies there are more with, the infrastructure. You talked about licensing and the network itself, and
Okay.
but not necessarily on sort of the organizational, the personnel side. Since those are still very separate. But it sounded like, yes, that he was seeing efficiencies.
Okay.
In that box, what came out too was, it was more of the whole infrastructure piece. Telephony came out a couple of times in those interviews. where
Yeah.
that was in, you could see that as being a cost efficient type where, you know, it was headed over. But it was more so on, like Melissa said, it was on the infrastructure, like you're leading to, is that's where it came out to, where that shared service piece was there.
Okay, as far as all right. Now, I would kind of be curious to see these MOUs as well, because in past lives where I've been in a shared environment, there could be, well, there was an understanding between the IT portion of the organizations as to sharing, but then on the business side, that's where the struggle always used to come in, as far as who got what when, and who got to drive the train, so to speak. And I think your comment, Melissa, about, you know, everybody wanting to cooperate there at the get-go, that's the key piece of it. And I think that's going to lie more between, I guess in our instance, the town and the Board of Ed, than I think maybe, you know, between you, Rick, and Jason. You know, I think you guys work on your own, but still the overall driver is still coming from the superintendent and or the town manager for each separate organization, I'm guessing.
Kind of looked at where should IT governance be taking place. I go back to a business environment. IT governance is part of that group that would help to determine where the priorities are and kind of buffer that feeling from a particular business area that I'm not getting what I wanted to get because the priority is someplace else.
Well, I guess the question is who's going to fill that role here? So, you know, in some of the corporate areas, there would be I guess, a governance board that would typically be, you know, the top heads or their designee from, say, like claims and personal lines and commercial lines and specialty, but at some point there has to be some kind of arbiter. So I think as we think about the shared services, is that I guess I just have some concerns as to how this is going to work here, because I don't see that the Board of Ed budget size wise is pretty significant, and they pretty much function as their own independent organization, if you will, from the town. So I don't know that the town manager or the Board of Selectmen is I mean, if it gets down to, all right, somebody's got to flip a coin and make a call, who that is. So I don't know that that's worth belaboring at this point, but I think it's something that we would kind of have to think about, depending on how the organization is going to shake out. Because I've been in some situations, there's been some the IT people are on board, and the business side, it went right to heck in a handbasket quick.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good point, and I think you and Bill are saying the same thing in terms of who sets the priorities.
Yeah,
where
I guess
wise. Yeah.
Yeah, because like in Enfield, Suffield, the IT guy, he's taking us marching orders from somewhere. So I guess the question is where is that coming from in those two towns?
Yes, and it sounds like actually in all these instances, it's really a dual reporting. So it's saying, and that's, I guess, why it does come down to that meeting the town manager and the superintendent on the same page, because you are essentially reporting to both sides. and juggling those competing, sometimes competing priorities.
Yeah, so I don't know if the Board of Selectmen is going to step into that role or how. I don't know. I guess it's, boy.
Maybe just a comment on some experience, and I don't know how well it fits with Simsbury, but what I found was if you got just the one or two heads of these organizations, because they tend to be a little bit removed from what's really happening a level or two below them. If they're making the decision sitting there with the head of IT, sometimes things get lost. So having an opportunity for them to hear it from their staff or the other side's staff on a business side is sometimes very helpful. I know we're getting into governance, and that's probably a discussion all by itself.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're serious about heading down this path, that's where you're going to be wrestling, is with the governance thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so setting up something that's relatively formal on the governance side that helps you get to the decisions and then helps you stick with those decisions. And what you really want is both the board and the town to walk away from a decision saying it was ours. We decided this is what comes up next. We decided to do it. And for whatever reason, if it's a great success, it's ours. And if it wasn't a great success, we had decided to do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in some companies, and I can speak to at least one of the two that I worked for, we got it to work. And the other one, it might have been just too big.
Enfield actually has, they call it an IT planning committee, and it's the superintendent, town manager, finance director for both the town and the Board of Ed, and then the IT person. And that's sort of their governance.
Right.
That the body that sort of sets priorities and gets together.
Well, yeah, that seems like a reasonable group. But, well, I guess the more as I'm thinking about it, as I've been speaking and listening to some of the other comments from you folks, it seems to me that I would certainly like to see what their rules of the road are for this, because that would probably shed a lot of light as to how this works or may not be working. It seems like they've got a way to make it work. The question is how well is it documented that we could take a look at it and see how we can apply that here.
Right.
Well, you certainly have two different type of concerns. Education needs to be able to do some of their educational stuff, but across the board, you essentially have the IT and business functions for both sides would be ideally the same software so that you have the common task. And that would be the easy part to bridge across both sides. The educational piece is going to be a little bit more difficult because one side has the interests and the other side, I shouldn't quite say it that way, but it probably doesn't care quite as much because they don't have the same interests. So and that's typically what happens. When I was at the Hartford, there was what was called specialty services, and they brought in what I used to call the big gorillas. So they would be going after the UPSs and the Walmarts, and they would get along. Everything would get along great until they had a shot at some big, huge account, and then things would go right to heck at that point. And then that's where the friction seemed to start. I don't know that we have necessarily that same situation here, but I just think size-wise, the Board of Ed is,
a couple of times the magnitude of just the town government, side of it. So, and it also depends, gosh darn it. It also depends on what we're going to do from a infrastructure, what the scope of the shared services are going to be. If we're going to make it just the infrastructure, the network and phones, et cetera, and step away from the applications per se, unless there's something really shareable like finance, then that's where I think the memorandum of understanding is the key piece here. So everybody knows where the guidelines are.
So it sounds like maybe the best place to focus is recommendations, or at least flagging sort of the high level things we should be considering in terms of the governance structure. In terms of what our deliverable should be. I kind of like that idea. Even if we don't come up with a specific recommendation, but even what you were just saying, Paul, in terms of, do we look at just the infrastructure, or are we looking at the infrastructure plus, so even just framing out the things we should be looking at, and we'll have to decide if we're going to move forward with it, and what the key elements will be.
Right. There may be something that's a big lift that gets us going, and then maybe from there, things may grow, or things may just totally fall apart too. And a lot of this does depend on personality, but to some degree. But yeah, I think that's the key piece, to see what we can frame out and where we feel comfortable and maybe where we don't.
Mm-hmm. So I did just look. I have Enfield's MOU. I have Mansfield. Suffield said she'd send it. I don't have it, but again, I'll circle back with her, because it would probably be helpful to have, as many as we can get. But that way we'd at least have 3 good examples that we could look at. So I can do that. After this meeting, I'll make sure that that's one of the follow-up items we do. And then in terms of, I'm just trying to think through how to kind of, after we look through those, maybe it's pulling out the key elements and kind of documenting those items that, like I said, we should be including in any arrangement that we consider. So that, again, we're maybe not making a specific recommendation, but having options for how we would do this.
Yeah, all right.
Just making a note to make sure I get Suffield. I don't know, do you want to continue to, I think our next regularly scheduled meeting is obviously the first Monday of December, but that's the full group. I don't know if we want to try to have something before that meeting for the group to look at and what that looks like, or if you think, or should we get back together again, this small group, before then? How do we want to kind of tackle next steps?
Seems like it would be a good idea if we could find an opportunity to get together for another hour or so. If you could share the sharing approaches, the formal documents that the towns have used, that might give us some information. Or in addition to that, if you could share any specifics you heard that sounded like they might be really beneficial for Simsbury, that would be good to know as well.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I was just kind of looking at the calendar. I mean, potentially we've got, if we just ignore Thanksgiving week, we could either get together next week if we have the materials, or the first full week of December, where there is another week there, because we meet again on the 7th. So
We have the 19th or the 3rd.
well, if we do a Thursday, wouldn't
True.
necessarily have
True.
to, but it seems like we've got, a couple of weeks there where we could maybe find some time.
I could definitely. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong date. Let's see.
Excuse me.
Yeah, so I guess it's your preference if you want to give ourselves a little bit of time to go through the documents and then maybe get together the week of the 30th, which is also the first week of December, or we could try to do something next week. It's up to you guys.
Well, it depends basically if you can get the paperwork.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely get 2 of the 3 MOUs out.
Yeah.
By the end, I mean, I could do that, by the end of the day tomorrow even. Or we could look to do, I guess if we're skipping over Thanksgiving week, it would probably be almost 3 weeks from now, but it would still be in advance of our next regular full task force meeting.
Let's see here. Well, I would say I don't know. I would like to get a hold of the 2 that we have, take a look at them. I wouldn't mind sitting down and if we kind of chewed through those next week and then maybe plan on one more session to put it together before the 7th. Crazy guy that I am.
What if we did like Monday the 30th? That would be a week in advance of our next regularly scheduled meeting.
Yeah.
And we can always
seems okay.
Is that good with everyone else?
Fine with me.
Okay.
Time of day is good for you. I'm good anytime after 11.
Want to just shoot for the same time, 3:30?
Works for me.
Sure.
Okay, so I will send out those 2 as soon as possible, and then I'll follow up with any others that I receive as soon as I get them. And Bill, you were saying to flag what specifically from what we learned from
anything that you heard from the towns that you thought were especially good ideas for Simsbury that would really be helpful, that would, in any way have us go in that direction.
Okay.
I'm kind of still looking at it as you folks are doing the sharing already. Informally, and I agree, and you and Rick and Jason are managing it. And I'm not especially sure exactly who does the IT governance other than you guys. I might be hearing it wrong. Maybe there's somebody else in the mix that I'm missing. It sounds like on a day-to-day, month-to-month, and even in a process, you folks are doing it. So I'd be very interested to know what makes these other towns feel that their sharing process is working very, very well, and how that might benefit Simsbury.
Okay.
Because even with infrastructure, at least what I'm seeing is you guys are discussing infrastructure decisions and managing the infrastructure as well, with everything that you're doing. So, I don't know if having someone sitting on top of that would get that to work better or just force things to work.
That's a good question.
Having seen the CIO job, many cases CIOs will tend to just force things to fit, and sometimes that's not a great idea.
No, I like that's a very good kind of way to think about this. What are we not doing that they're doing, and how their decision-making process looks as compared with ours, and how might that benefit us, if at all. And I think we learned a lot from those conversations. But if I look at it with that kind of question in mind, I think we can pull out some stuff from our notes that will be helpful, or at least start to answer that question.
Right.
Okay. All right. Anything else for today? Like I said, I'll send that stuff out. We'll plan on the 30th so that we have time. I mean, we can of course do stuff by email as long as we're not, dialoguing and doing anything that would violate our, open meeting. But I think that's a good next step.
Yeah.
So Melissa, those agreements, you're going to send them out individually, or are you just going to post them up there on the drive?
I can do both. I'll send them by email so that they're easily accessible, but I'll make sure they're up there. That way everyone has access to them. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to kind of look at them in depth, so it'll be interesting to see kind of what the commonalities are, what kind of things seem to be consistent across towns, and maybe some things that are lacking. So I think that'll help. But
Just just one comment to Bill's remark earlier is it may be working well without a memo of understanding, but it might be simply because the personalities are such. But if we want that kind of stuff to continue, maybe we need to take that kind of cooperation and kind of make it in writing so that future will essentially be able to continue a similar fashion.
Great point.
And I don't mean future in a short sense.
I think that's what Bill was really looking at. If it's not broke, why fix it, if you will? But what the contribution of having an agreement existing will help us present and future as well. Not so much make strategic organizational changes as well. But yeah, Bill, I mean, that even hit my brain is I took my notes and I don't have them in front of me, unfortunately, but for the next time we meet, I'll look at those pieces and what we do and what they were saying and find, okay, this is what we're doing, the same thing. And this is where they were unique, and this is where we were unique. So I will do that.
Great.
That's a very good point. I mean, at bare minimum, where we start, probably we should absolutely document what we're already doing.
Yep.
Yeah, and those agreements, I mean, how they were brought out, they could be, I think they're one pagers, maybe, Melissa, a one pager, right? So it's not like a hard contract agreement that both sides, put blood on and sign it, right? I think It's just a policy.
Oh, that's the fun part.
I want to be there for that.
That's the fun part.
Only at the firehouse.
Yeah, only at the firehouse, right? Exactly.
That's funny. No, but that's such a good point. I think that should be our bare minimum deliverable is to maybe we do that. Maybe we have come up with a one pager that really outlines what we're doing already. So that, yeah, that's our baseline. And like you said, maybe that's it, but also it at least gives us our starting point for.
And then the other thing to add here, and Melissa, you just spurred the thought going to what Bill had said for the governance piece. So what's happening too is that there isn't a steering committee as well as where Melissa, I, the business manager, and Jason would meet. I think it's every month to make sure what we're doing is pretty much on track and we're not in left field and he's in right field, that kind of thing. So there is that piece of governance there that does exist. Unfortunately, with some health issues that has occurred, that committee's really at a pause right now. But I'm positive it'll start back up shortly, which will add that other piece of governance.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Good. Cool. Well, I actually think this has been really helpful. I think those are the two pieces, really thinking about documenting what we're already doing, and then for our next meeting, talking about kind of maybe not recommendations, but maybe an outline of, a governance structure and things to consider, and that piece of it. So cool. Anything else for today?
We've covered it.
Yeah.
I think we're good.
Okay.
Thank you all for your time.
Okay.
I'll send out the documents, and then I'll also send out a notice for our next meeting on the 30th and go from there.
Okay. Cool.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, see you all
See you
later.
guys.
Take
See you
care.
next time.
All right.